In a chamber thick with silence, beneath the cavernous ceiling of the UN General Assembly, Donald Trump leaned into the microphone with that familiar arrogance etched into every syllable. Cameras clicked. Delegates shifted uneasily. Then he said it, slowly, deliberately, as if carving his words into the walls of history. "Cross me, and you'll regret it." A murmur rippled through the room, not because of the threat, they were used to those, but because of who it was directed at. Across the hall sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, calm, unmoved, eyes locked on Trump like a hawk sizing up a dying lion. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply waited. Trump, emboldened by the tension, continued, "Africa needs to know its place. You don't challenge a superpower without consequences." Gasps. Journalists started typing. Phones lit up. And then, stillness. Traoré slowly stood. The camera panned. Every diplomat, every aide, every leader held their breath. He stepped forward with the calm of a man who had seen death and defied it. With a voice low but sharp as steel, he said, "Then watch me." The room fell into stunned silence. This wasn't just a verbal duel. It was a global turning point, the old world's muscle meeting the new world's defiance. And Traoré wasn't here to play the game. He was here to burn the board. Back in Ouagadougou, a sea of supporters erupted in cheers. Screens lit up with his face. Hashtags exploded. In African streets, chants echoed, "We fear no empire." This wasn't just Traoré answering Trump. This was a continent standing up, and daring the West to try them. Traoré's words, "Then watch me," weren't just a comeback. They were a detonation. But what most of the world didn't see was the weight behind them. The silence in that chamber wasn't just about fear. It was recognition. History, once ignored, was now staring the West in the face, and it wore the uniform of a Burkinabe soldier. Trump smirked, leaning back in his chair as if Traoré's defiance were a joke. But his eyes flickered. He knew something had changed. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials scrambled. "Get us a list of Burkina Faso's new partners," one aide whispered. "Russia? China? Iran? Who's backing him?" But it wasn't foreign allies that gave Traoré strength. It was memory. The memory of Sankara, gunned down with foreign fingerprints all over the bullets. The memory of Lumumba, dragged and executed with Western blessings. The memory of every African leader who dared to rise, and was crushed under the boot of civilized nations. Traoré wasn't speaking for himself. He was channeling generations of resistance. The way he stood, the way he spoke, it was calculated. It was ancestral. And it was unforgiving. Meanwhile, Trump, still posturing, announced an emergency economic forum. Sanctions were hinted. Trade restrictions prepared. But they were weapons of the past. Traoré knew the game. He had read every page of imperial playbooks. And now, he was writing a new one. In Africa, leaders started watching. Mali, Niger, Guinea, all taking notes. Could they speak like that? Could they push back too? In Washington, Trump's circle whispered, "He's not playing by the rules." Exactly. That was the point. And the world, whether it wanted to or not, had just begun watching Africa's counterstrike unfold. In the hours following the confrontation, the media spun like a hurricane. Western outlets fixated on Trump's theatrics, President warns rogue leader, but none could ignore what wasn't said. Traoré had left the podium after his short but volcanic reply. No follow-up press briefing. No interviews. Just silence. And yet, that silence echoed louder than Trump's tantrums. In Burkina Faso's capital, Ouagadougou, the footage was replayed on loop, not just on screens but in people's hearts. Kids at school began mimicking Traoré's stance. Artists painted murals of the moment. Grandmothers whispered, "He carries the fire of our ancestors." Meanwhile, Trump raged behind the scenes. "This isn't just about Traoré," he barked at his team. "It's about what he's inspiring. Shut him down." His administration drafted a new initiative, the African Stability Pact. A euphemism for economic leashes, aid with strings, military advisors with agendas. But Traoré had already moved ahead. A week later, Traoré stood in front of an assembly of non-Western leaders, a summit organized not in Geneva or DC, but in Bamako. Russia, Brazil, Iran, Algeria, Indonesia, all sent envoys. The message was clear, the center of gravity was shifting, and when Traoré finally spoke, it wasn't for applause. It was a blueprint for liberation. Africa is not a battlefield for Western egos. We are a continent of gold, of soil, of mind, and we will never again beg for our own reflection. The room erupted, not with noise, but with conviction. Every nod, every stare, every clenched fist, was a vote. A quiet rebellion forming under the radar. Back in the US, Trump watched the summit on a flickering screen. "He's rallying the others," he muttered. And deep down, beneath the ego, beneath the bluster, Trump felt something he hadn't in years. Panic. While Washington debated punishments behind closed doors, Traoré was building something out in the open. Not walls, not armies, a movement. After the Bamako summit, Traoré didn't return home to rest. He flew straight to Istanbul, where President Erdogan greeted him not with protocol, but with respect. Then to Tehran, then to Brasilia. Each meeting ended the same way. With a handshake that ignored Washington. Back in the West, headlines grew more frantic. Is Traoré forming a new axis? Burkina Faso, a threat to global stability? From rebel to ring leader? In response, the U.S. Treasury whispered the word sanctions. Quiet meetings with European partners began. Frozen assets, travel bans, military aid suspensions. They expected panic. Instead, they got preparedness. Traoré's government had already moved gold reserves out of Western vaults. French-trained officers were dismissed months earlier. American NGOs quietly asked to renew visas, and were denied. And the alliances? China offered infrastructure deals, with no lectures. Russia agreed to intelligence sharing. Algeria supplied grain. Indonesia opened trade channels. One after another, global powers tired of the old world order found a place in Traoré's new circle. They fear what we build, Traoré told his cabinet. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's free. Meanwhile, Trump seethed at the intelligence briefings. They're not scared of us anymore, he muttered. For decades, Washington played kingmaker in Africa. But now, with every photo op, every defiant speech, and every country that shook Traoré's hand, the throne stood emptier. And Traoré? He wasn't asking for a seat. He was flipping the table. The American press was no longer just watching, they were rallying. Fox News declared Traoré the most dangerous man in Africa. CNN called him a wild card with revolutionary appeal. But in the Situation Room, things were far from theatrical. Trump slammed his fist on the table during a closed-door security briefing. He's building an empire. And we're watching him do it. Military advisors nodded. The CIA passed around satellite photos of gold convoys moving through Niamey, uranium shipments rerouted from French territories, and a string of new anti-drone systems placed in Ouagadougou. He's preparing for something, one general said. And he's doing it without us. Trump leaned forward, eyes burning. This ends one of two ways. Either he bends the knee, or we break his legs. But Traoré didn't bend. He didn't bluff either. Instead, he did what no one expected. He invited the African Union to Burkina Faso. Not for speeches, but for strategy. Behind closed doors, presidents, revolutionaries, ex-generals, and ministers sat together. Not as colonies, but as equals. And then Traoré made his move. A Pan-African Defense Charter, an agreement to collectively respond to foreign interference. Any attack on one, would be an attack on all. Washington's bluff had just been called. Trump scoffed in public, but panicked in private. They're trying to become ungovernable. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before the crowd with fire in his voice. They think they can end this their way, but Africa has chosen a different ending. Washington sent ships. Not with flags, but with threats. 3 U.S. destroyers moved quietly into the Gulf of Guinea. Drones soared over Mali. Whispers in Niger, Chad, and Senegal grew louder. They weren't whispers of diplomacy. They were rumors of regime change. In the West Wing, Trump played tough. He tweeted, "We've contained worse before. This man's a mosquito." But in Africa, that mosquito carried a fever. A fever of revolution. Traoré didn't blink. He activated alliances the West never believed could function, let alone unite. Suddenly, supplies flowed from Algeria. Engineers from Iran landed quietly in Bamako. Chinese technicians were spotted fixing airstrips in northern Burkina Faso. And in a surprise move, Russia offered satellite intel, live feed. Traoré smiled, then dropped the line that sent shockwaves across every Western channel. "You want firepower? Then you'll see what Africa burns with." That same day, videos went viral. Armed villagers dismantling a French surveillance outpost. Drone footage of American contractors quietly retreating. A Pan-African flag being raised over a repurposed U.S. facility. And in the streets? People danced, not because they had one. But because, for once, they were no longer afraid to lose. Washington was stunned. CNN's headline read, "He called their bluff. Now they don't know the game." In Trump's war room, silence reigned, until he spat the words. "I want him humiliated. Before the world." But across the ocean, Traoré was already preparing the next stage. And it wouldn't be fought with guns. It would be fought with truth. The UN held a special emergency session. The Western delegates arrived first, sharp suits, colder faces. Trump came in last, flanked by aides, eyes burning with pride and paranoia. The seat for Burkina Faso sat empty. Until the doors opened. Ibrahim Traoré entered in traditional Sahelian cloth, no tie, no guards, no fear. He didn't shake hands. He didn't smile. He walked to the podium, looked over the hall, and said, "They sent bombs. We sent grain. They sent soldiers. We built schools. Now they send lies, and I send the truth." Trump chuckled audibly. He stood and interrupted, pointing directly at Traoré. "Truth," he barked. "Truth is what we say it is. We write history. You'll read it, if you're still around." Gasps echoed. A few delegates smirked nervously. But Traoré didn't move. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. Held it up. "This is what your drones saw. This is what your mercenaries did. This is what your news won't show." He handed it to the UN tech crew. Seconds later, the screen behind him lit up. Footage of shell-shocked children in Gaza. U.S. weapons marked with barcodes buried in burnt African soil. Emails between Western firms and corrupt local elites plotting mineral grabs. Silence filled the hall. Not from respect, but revelation. Traoré looked at Trump, then simply said, "Your empire writes history with ink and oil. I write it in blood and stone, and it will last longer." And before anyone could speak, he left the podium. Some delegates clapped. Others froze. But one thing was clear. The West's narrative wasn't bulletproof anymore. Traoré had cracked it, on live feed. The morning after the UN broadcast, panic rippled through Western capitals. Markets stumbled. Media anchors stumbled over their scripts. And Washington? It struck back the only way it knew how: sanctions. Sanctions on Burkina Faso's exports. Sanctions on banking access. Sanctions on any company daring to work with Traoré's government. CNN's headline read, "Traoré's recklessness endangers West African stability." But Traoré was already 10 steps ahead. That same afternoon, he landed in Bamako. Then Niamey. Then Conakry. And in each capital, he repeated the same message. If they isolate one of us, they've declared war on all of us. By week's end, 7 African leaders stood beside him. Some had been cautious allies. Others had once kept their distance. But now? They saw what Traoré had exposed. The greed, the control, the quiet colonial hand beneath Western diplomacy. Together, they signed the Sahel Unity Accord. Gold, lithium, rare earth minerals, all pooled. No more foreign firms without regional approval. No more dollars dictating African sovereignty. In Washington, Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, called it economic suicide. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands called it something else. Our second independence. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't need to. As he told the BBC reporter trying to corner him. They have sanctions. We have soil. They have banks. We have brothers. And with that, the so-called isolation backfired. Burkina Faso wasn't alone. It had become the nucleus of a new African order. Western analysts predicted it confidently. Burkina Faso will crumble under pressure. Even the Financial Times published a front-page headline. Traoré faces breaking point. But in Ouagadougou, something different was happening. Rather than protests, there were processions. Rather than silence, there was song. Women marched with pans in their hands, banging them in rhythm. Children painted flags on their cheeks, Burkina, Niger, Mali. And in every neighborhood, one chant echoed through the alleys. We don't beg, we build. That week, France froze assets. The US cut military cooperation. And the IMF suspended all talks. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't rush to a podium or call for pity. Instead, he gathered his cabinet in the underground war room of the presidency. No cameras. No speeches. Just strategy. His instructions were direct. No deals. No retreats. Let the world watch who survives the winter. And survive they did, with help from unexpected allies. Turkey offered grain. Iran sent fuel. Even Brazil, quietly but decisively, opened new trade lines through West Africa. The West had intended to freeze Traoré's momentum. Instead, they'd made him into a symbol. In Accra, a young Ghanaian student tweeted. My president bends when they raise their voice. Traoré raises his voice when they raise their flag. That tweet was shared over 4 million times in 48 hours. By week's end, even skeptical African leaders were calling Traoré. Not to criticize, but to ask how they could join. The world saw a defiant nation under siege. But Traoré? He saw the beginning of a new continent unchained. The final summit was held in Geneva. White marble walls. Blue banners reading, Global Stability Through Partnership. Rows of powerful men in suits. And at the center stage, a chair marked, Burkina Faso. Most assumed it would remain empty. Until the doors opened. Ibrahim Traoré walked in, alone. No entourage. No translator. Just him, in his sand-colored fatigues and boots still dusty from Ouagadougou's streets. The room hushed. He sat. Slowly. Then leaned into the mic and spoke without notes. You speak of stability. But you mean silence. You speak of partnership. But you mean obedience. Africa hears you, and rejects you. A few gasps. An EU delegate turned red. The French ambassador stood to leave. Traoré didn't stop. You froze our accounts. We built our own banks. You cut our aid. We cut your influence. You threatened us with war. And we answered with independence. Silence fell again, but this time, not from shock. From something deeper. Reckoning. In the back row, a young delegate from South Sudan wiped a tear. In the hallway, journalists scrambled to rewrite headlines. Traoré stood and delivered his final line. Africa is not your charity case. We are not waiting for a seat. We're building our own table, and we won't ask for your permission. With that, he walked out. No applause. But across the global south, screens lit up. From Nairobi to Caracas, from Johannesburg to Jakarta. The speech went viral. Millions shared it with the caption, "History didn't knock. It broke the door down." And in Burkina Faso, one banner flew from the presidential palace. It read, "We bowed to none. We rose, together."